In this Openstax lecture, we will discuss the third chapter pertaining to economic foundations, money, and rates. Commonly, microeconomics and macroeconomics are prerequisite courses for a first-level finance course. Consequently, the first half of this chapter is either a primer or a reminder of basic economic principles. It is essential for any company to understand the economic environment in which it operates. Microeconomics focuses on the decisions and actions of businesses and customers within the economy. The driving forces behind macroeconomics are market supply and demand for products and services. Demand is the quantity of a good or service that buyers are willing and able to purchase at various prices during a given time period. You should understand this condition and, by extension, the inverse relationship it represents. The higher the price of a good goes, the less willing and able consumers are to buy it. The utility the good provides declines because the price of that utility increases. If certain economic factors change, the demand curve may shift. These factors include consumer income, population size, consumer taste and preferences, or the prices of other goods. If you get a raise at an off-campus job, they may be more likely to purchase a second cup of coffee at the local shop. Note that an increase in demand is represented as a movement of the demand curve to the right. The opposite dynamic exists for those supplying goods and services to the market. Supply is the quantity of a good or service a party is willing to sell at various prices during a given time period. This is a relationship. Equilibrium occurs when quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Determine the market clearing equilibrium price. Equilibrium is a static position such that the price will remain unchanged unless market forces change, and as market forces change, the supplier and/or demand curve changes, thus moving the equilibrium price to a new market clearing level. Changing market conditions affect the movement of the supply and demand curves rather than a movement along the curves. Many factors can cause the shift of the supply and demand curves. Note that you should identify what these curve shifting factors might be. Also consider what would cause a movement along curves. Equilibrium is the point at which the supply and demand curves intersect. At the equilibrium price, the quantity demanded will equal the quantity supplied. In this example, that occurs with 30 pizzas at $15. Macroeconomics investigates how prices are determined in the economy. Macroeconomics, however, looks at the economy as a whole. It focuses on inflation, unemployment, and production growth. Inflation, or a general increase in price levels, impacts the economies as a whole. Inflation varies, sometimes considerably, among regions and particular goods and services. We'll later discuss foreign exchange, but note that inflation causes the country's currency to weaken. If an item goes up in price by 5%, but a consumer's income only rises by 2% over the same period, then the consumer has lost purchasing power. There are many methods to measure inflation because it's not the same everywhere for every item. Overall economic policy purposes, a broad inflation measure may be appropriate. The GDP deflator would be appropriate. To see how inflation affects consumers, the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, is used. Inflation sampling methods can reveal more focused inflation measures, such as core inflation. Note that inflation remained especially low. Those of you may recall in the early 1980s, inflation exceeded 10%. But note that recent ultra-low inflation has been the exception, not the rule. And in fact, we have seen it spike since COVID. Unemployment. In a way, a person must qualify for unemployment status. To satisfy the common definition, a person must be jobless but able to work and have taken proactive steps to find work. Recent unemployment history shows that it's been overlaid with a history of U.S. business cycles. Weakening business cycles correlate with unemployment, a coincident indicator of business activity. GDP is the total value of goods and services produced within a country's borders. In other words, its total output. It is also a coincident economic indicator. GDP is measured by adding all the items that are purchased in the economy. Purchases are divided among four broad categories: consumption, investment, government, and net exports. Note that there is a difference between nominal and real GDP. More sophisticated tools can be used to separate real from nominal GDP, but we work an approximation to subtract the inflation rate during a period of time from GDP measured over this period. This was created by Dr. Irving Fisher of Yale University over 100 years ago. Previous sections included economic indicators of the overall economy, indicators to identify how the economy is performing and where it is in the business cycle. Business cycle means that the economy does not move forward or back in a straight line, but experiences periods of growth, slowdown, contraction, and back to growth. From trough to peak, back to trough is a full business cycle. Growth cannot and has not continued unabated. It always falls back during periods of economic weakness or recession. Likewise, weaker economic conditions or recessions eventually turn around. Careful economic management is needed to navigate the inevitable ups and downs. Economic data is plentiful and held by both public and private institutions. A particularly useful source of such data and analysis is the NBER's National Bureau of Economic Research. Although not the ultimate arbiter of economic analysis, the NBER is commonly considered a reliable decider of when a recession occurs. The business cycle varies. Full cycles from trough to trough have ranged from as short as 28 months to as long as 128 months. The market for loanable funds. It is like the market for goods and services covered previously, but this market for funds in the market follows similar dynamics of supply and demand. In the market for loanable funds, there are two counterparties: those entities who hold excess funds, or those who have more than they can currently spend, and those who experience a deficit of funds. The financial market includes financial institutions that bring together both parties. The process is known as intermediation. They stand in between those with excess funds and those who need funds. Analogous to the market for goods and services being a function of price, the supply and demand for loanable funds is also a function of the price of money, i.e., the interest rate. The higher the price of money or the interest rate, the lower the demand will be to borrow money. The higher the interest rate, the more willing holders of excess cash are to lend it. As before, the market clearing rate is the point where supply equals demand for loanable funds. Nominal interest rates. In the same way we distinguish nominal GDP from real GDP, we can think of nominal and real interest rates. We use the analysis of Irving Fisher to apply the approximate Fisher effect. We simply subtract the inflation rate for a given period from the nominal interest rate for this period to strip out inflation, leaving a real rate of interest. The real rate tells the borrower the cost to borrow if the effect of inflation was eliminated. Risk premiums. Not all interest rates are the same. They are set by market forces, but they all follow the principle of risk premiums. You may already know about the fact that riskier borrowers pay higher interest rates. Although U.S. government securities are not risk-free, they are nearly credit risk-free. As such, they can be considered the base layer of a composite of risks taken by the lender. These risks do not imply a borrower will default completely, only that the full amount loaned may not be repaid. Borrowers at different risk levels pay different interest rates. The very safe U.S. government represents a floor for interest rates. Loans to prime business borrowers are riskier, followed by the highest risk category, credit card users. Note that a higher profit margin is built into credit card loan rates. Here's an interesting fact. For many centuries, the charging of interest on loan money was widely considered sinful and consequently prohibited in Christian societies. Many Bible passages were read as prohibitions against usury, for example, Deuteronomy 28:12 and 23:19. However, during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church began to understand that interest was a legitimate compensation for taking risk. The modern era of banking ensued. This is according to Niall Ferguson, The Ascent of Money, A Financial History of the World, in New York Penguin Press 2022. Explain the relationship between interest rates and risk. The downward sloping curve below represents borrowers, or those who demand loanable funds. Higher interest rates are associated with lower quantities demanded of loanable funds. The equilibrium occurs where the supply of loanable funds intersects the demand for loanable funds, giving us an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds and an equilibrium interest rate according to Figure 3.17, the equilibrium in the loanable funds market. There are many types of borrowers and many types of lending products. The borrower and lending product types determine the interest rates charged. Different rates are due to different risk premiums. The higher commercial bank interest rate on credit card plans for all accounts, this is noted here, is double digits. The one immediately beneath it is the bank prime loan rate, and the base rate is the 3-month Treasury constant maturity rate. An FX, or foreign exchange rate, is the price of one currency in terms of another. It is the quantity of one currency that is exchanged for another expressed as a ratio. The FX rate can be expressed in terms of either quoted currency. The text example of MXN1 equal USD 0.0625 is conventionally read as $0.0625 buys 1.0 Mexican peso. From the U.S. perspective, it is written in terms of the home currency, the U.S. dollars, and so would be a direct quote. In this case, the U.S. dollars is the buying currency. The rate can just as easily be quoted from the MXN perspective, where the MXN is the buying currency. To convert the FX quotation, the reciprocal of the original quote is calculated. This is also shown in the text. The FX rate from the MXN perspective, when it is the buying currency, would be 1 USD equals MXN 16. From the Mexican perspective, this is a direct quote. By convention, the FX market, although not often in textbooks, the first currency of the quotation is the base currency and the second is the buying currency. This convention is not universally followed outside actual market practitioners, so users of foreign exchange must be aware of what the FX quotation actually means. Market conditions not only influence interest rates as described earlier, they also influence foreign exchange rates. When conditions cause a currency to strengthen, it is said to appreciate. Conditions can, of course, cause a currency to weaken or depreciate. Going back to the USD MXN exchange rate, if the rate changes to 1 USD MXN 18, then the MXN is depreciated. Even though the figure has gone from MXN 16 to MXN 18, it means that it now costs MXN 18 to buy $1 when previously it cost MXN 16. More pesos are needed to buy the same USD. The MXN is depreciated. Seen from the other perspective, the USD has appreciated by the same percentage. Spot market. When an FX transaction takes place now, it is known as a spot market. Spot refers to a time period, not a place. When the counterparties to an FX transaction agree to the exchange of currencies at a particular rate and consummate the transaction by effecting the exchange of currencies, this is a spot transaction. When each counterparty receives the other's currency, the transaction is settled. To accommodate the actual fund transfers, spot is defined as settlement within 2 days of when the transaction was negotiated. Exchange rate risk. By its nature, an international company faces exchange rate risk. This risk can take 3 forms: transaction, translation, or economic. From a company's perspective, transaction risk is normally most important. This is because transaction risk can change the value of actual cash inflows and outflows, and cash is the key driver of company value. An example of transaction risk is when a company expects to be paid by a customer when the customer is paying in a currency other than the seller's home currency. For example, an American company may be paid in euros by a French buyer. If the euro depreciates against the dollar by the time the transaction settles, then the seller or company will receive a lower value than the receivable on its books. A similar situation arises if a buyer or company agrees to pay for merchandise in a currency other than its own. If the foreign currency payable appreciates, it means the buyer or company must pay more of its own currency for settlement. Translation risk is also known as accounting risk because it involves the translation of foreign subsidiaries and affiliate books into the company's home currency. No actual cash flow changes, simply the book value of subsidiaries. Consequently, translation risk is not considered as significant a risk. Economic exposure is the risk that a change in exchange rates will impact the business's overall structure or competitiveness. When Japanese auto companies moved some production to the United States, it posed additional structural risk. If a netting system is arranged among the various European operations, it will change the company's economic exposure. A currency appreciates when it takes more of the other currency being traded to buy it. A currency depreciates when it takes less of the other currency being traded to buy it. Translation exposure is the risk that a value of a business's expected receipts or expenses will change as a result of a change in currency exchange rates. Example 1. A U.S. company sells a product to a UK-based customer who will pay the seller in pound sterling in 30 days. If the pound sterling depreciates during the 30 days, the seller will lose value in U.S. dollar terms. Example 2. A U.S. company owns a Mexican supplier, pesos, for supplies purchased. If the Mexican peso depreciates in value, the U.S. buyer will pay fewer U.S. dollars in value. Indexes. An index is used to track the performance of a particular aspect of the economy or financial market. An index helps compare the level of a variable at one point in time to its level at another point in time. Indexes are often used when movement over time is more important than the absolute level of the variable at any one point in time. Somewhat analogous to the Edgar system used by the SEC, the Federal Reserve System maintains an enormous repository of economic data. Its friendly name is FRED, or the Federal Reserve Economic Data Database. The data is divided into logical segments and is readily available for use. Useful figures in the text came from downloadable data from FRED. Indices are extremely useful devices to track the movement of a particular data set over time. Such data can be economic or inflation, stock prices like the Dow Jones Industrial Index, or home prices, the Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. Since an index number is just that, a number without units, it is most useful to track changes in value rather than absolute values. To determine the index, a basket of goods is collected and its value is normalized, usually to a value of 100. Subsequent changes from 100 indicate the rate of change of the goods being measured. Here's an interesting fact. When the Dow Jones Industrial Average was established in 1896, it comprised 12 company shares. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was subsequently increased to 30 companies. However, none of the original companies remained in the index. General Electric, or GE, was the last of the original 12 companies, but it was dropped from the index in 2018. Using an index can help compare the impact that inflation has had on the cost of living in different countries. Here we see the base year is 1970 because the US, Switzerland, and Japan are all starting off at 100. We can then see how things have changed over the past 50 years. Thanks for watching and listening. Be sure to like and subscribe.